What am I doing? Playing tennis, of course, because we remember the great story of the Battle of Agincourt and Henry V and Charles VI. Henry V of France and Charles VI, Henry V of England and Charles VI of France. Now, these two kings, they had it out at the Battle of Agincourt, and we remember that Henry V won the day, even though he had a smaller army that was depleted and dying because of the cold winter and the flat lands that did not provide him any shelter. However, we know that shortly after the Battle of Agincourt, both Charles VI of France and Henry V of England died. And so, who was left to reign England and France after Henry V's death? But none other than his one-year-old son, Henry VI. So we now pick the story back up when Henry VI is the king of England and France. Wow, just at the ripe old age of 1 year old, he is the king of England and France, two of the greatest nations in the entire world. Now, here is the story that unfolds, because one of the biggest questions that you might have is what happened to that Dauphin, the Prince of France, who was the son of Charles VI. Surely he didn't just go away. And you'd be right. He did not just go away. In fact, he wanted to take over the French throne after the death of his father, Charles VI. Now, you would imagine that most of the French people would be very excited about this because they probably wouldn't want an English king. However, there was a group of people called the Burgundians that were from Burgundy. And the Burgundians, they did not want Henry VI to not be king of France. In fact, they wanted an English king, even though they were French. I think most of this had to do with the fact that they did not respect the Dauphin, who would then become Charles VII. But indeed, what ends up happening is that there's a group of people that does respect the Dauphin and wants him to be king because they want a Frenchman in charge of their country. And then there's these Burgundians who want an Englishman, this King Henry VI, to be on the throne. And so what happens? Joan of Arc, one of the most incredible historical figures throughout world history, shows up on the scene. That's right, Joan of Arc, a woman from the countryside in France, receives a great message from God Almighty through 3 angels. And these 3 angels tell Joan that she is the one to save all of France, to end the civil war, and to make the Dauphin the next king of France. And so what she does is Joan of Arc decides, you know what, I'm going to gather up different people with me and I'm going to tell them that this message from God is here and that we are to save all of France. And so that's exactly what she does. People begin to hear that she has heard from God Almighty, and they begin to attach themselves to her. They begin to follow her and say, wherever you go, Joan, we will go with you. And so what she decides to do is that she needs to go tell this great and almighty plan to the Dauphin. So she goes to the Dauphin and she knocks, and they answer. And the courtiers go to the Dauphin and they say, there's this woman here for you. Her name is Joan. And she says that she's here to save you and to save the French at the Battle of Orleans. Well, the Dauphin says, well, this is interesting. She's from where? And they say, well, she's here with a message from God. And they thought, well, maybe she's a prophet. So the Dauphin said, well, if indeed she is here from God and she has received divine help, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off my crown and take off my robes. And if she can identify me, then she will really be a prophet, even though I will not look like a king. So the Dauphin very cleverly thinks that maybe he can trick her so that he can kind of push her aside and not worry about it anymore. But what happens is that Joan goes into the king's courts and looks at the king, who has the robe on and has the king's crown on, and says, you are not the king. And then looks directly at the Dauphin and says, you are the king. We are going to put on the throne as King Charles VII. Well, the Dauphine, being a very haughty character, decides, you know what, this sounds pretty good. Let's have her lead our army and lead us into the Battle of Orleans. Well, Joan, being a great leader, led the soldiers into battle, and they defeated the Burgundians at the Battle of Orleans. Well, now there's only one more thing to do, to coronate King Charles VII as King of France. So what Joan wanted to do was to take the Dauphine to Reims. And she went to Reims. And they thought, oh, we're good here. We're going to coronate him. And so they did indeed. They coronated him and he became King Charles VII of France. But they were not going to be able to have this for long, because King Charles VII began to get a little eager to make a deal and strike a deal with the Burgundians that were left, because one thing you need to know about the Burgundians is that they were French noblemen, and it was very important that all the noblemen were on the side of King Charles VII, but these noblemen, they were not. And so King Charles VII thought, well, maybe what I'll do is I will convince these people to love me and to see me as their king. And so he made some deals with them. But it didn't go well for him. The deals fell through. And what ended up happening is that Joan of Arc was taken captive by the Burgundians and the English. And in 1431, 1931, hilarious. In 1431, Joan of Arc was murdered. She was burned alive, because the English and the Burgundians thought not that she was a prophetess from God, but that she was a sorceress. And so they killed her. And the Dauphin, King Charles VII of France, did nothing about it, even though Joan of Arc is the reason why he was wearing the crown of France in the first place. That, my friends, is a sad ending of the story and life of Joan of Arc. Valiant and strong, but ended in betrayal. Now, what we're going to do at the end of this lesson, and what you're going to do for your classwork on this particular lesson, is we're going to look at a painting from the 1800s that is actually a painting of when Joan of Arc received the message from the three angels and saints that came to her. So when you're looking at this particular painting, I want you to observe it, and I want you to look at the setting and scene that you find the main figure in, as well as the characteristics and qualities of not only Joan of Arc, but also of the three saint angels that come to speak to her and share this message from God. Now, that is a story of Joan of Arc. Thanks for tuning in.